Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin, and we are back with another Q&A. I know our last episode was a Q&A, but I went back to Russia, so we got a little busy, but we're here to answer some of your amazing questions. We know that with every weekly installment of World War Now, you guys often get some questions because we put in a lot of background stuff that we don't have time to fully, fill in every single hour and a half, hour, 45 minutes weekly show that we do. So we love doing these. It's always good answering your questions. So Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And of course, the first question, which I think we should get into here, is from Arthur. So I'll just read out the question here. I would like to hear your thoughts on how ethnic Russians and the Russian Orthodox Christians should view the Soviet Union and the Soviet era in Russian history, and whether it is appropriate for us to defend certain aspects of the Soviet state through the lens of it being the representation of Russia and the Russian people for much of the 20th century. For a lot of people in the world, the Soviet Union is a replacement term for Russia, and when foreigners attack the Soviet Union or its policies, it is usually done because the attacker is Russophobic and wishes to poke at Russians, attacking the Soviet Union as a representation of the Russian state. Is it appropriate in such moments to defend the USSR? Is it appropriate to praise certain aspects of the Soviet era? Thank you. I suppose as a preliminary answer, I would state that yes, to be fair, you need to be a Christian, so you need to aim to tell the truth, right? Especially when in cases such as this, when it's defending your fatherland, people, you're being patriotic. And in this case, you're open to actually criticize if the criticism is valid. For example, just like in the USSR, certain domestic policies were very, very wrong. Some even foreign policy decisions were inappropriate. I think it's completely fine to agree with the criticism of foreigners. If, however, you see that they're actually trying to poison the well, trying to sort of bait you into actually disrespecting your own country, you should again answer very, very carefully, not leading them down this false belief that the Russian people are somehow this Gog and Magog international enemy, which all the entire world should be rise against. But in terms of answering your question about, I think this is very important. Like myself being a Russian Orthodox Christian, we've all had to struggle with this issue of, well, how do you view the USSR period of Russia as still being Russia, despite the name change, despite the anti-Russian, anti-Christian ideology leading the nation, and even many people, many members of the elite of the country actually not being ethnically Russian nor Christian, and still guiding the country in maybe even a bad direction throughout most of its history recently. So how do you view that positively, or how can you love the country anyhow? Well, I think you do what Christians have done for the last few centuries in history, for example, still remain patriotic even through the illness times of their country's history. The best example would be the Byzantine Romans, so the late Roman imperial citizens who stayed loyal to their country even throughout iconoclasm, when there was literally 80 to 100 years of their own imperial leaders who were destroying icons, desecrating hundreds, if not thousands of churches, destroying miracle-working icons, relics of saints as well. A really dark period in Byzantine history, very similar to the Soviet Union, in fact, when a lot of people were simply, a lot of people in the elite were belonging to a heretical sect, in some ways much, very akin to a lot of the Protestant denominations we see today. And yet Byzantine Romans still remained loyal. They still defended their country from foreign invasion, from the Muslims, especially from the Muslim Arabs, and from even some European countries as well. Of course, this caused various problems, but they still remained strong throughout that entire period. Another, of course, great example would be the early Christians as well, who served like Saint Demetrius, we speak about Saint George, the two very obvious examples, but there are others like Saint Fyodor Tyron as well, and other martyrs who served in the Roman imperial army, despite the fact that the Roman state, the Roman Empire during, say, Diocletian's reign was openly persecuting Christians, and until, of course, the time came for them to make anti-Christian decisions as soldiers or as officers in the actual military, they remained loyal and they remained patriots of their country. So that's probably a good example, as well as the Orthodox Christian Japanese who fought against the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War. So it's actually possible to still be a patriot and still serve your country, even if your country is making the wrong decisions, maybe overall, or heading in the wrong direction, until, of course, the choice falls on you too. But you do need to view your country as well. You have to view it, because you love your country, right? You have to view it as being in a bad place. And historically, this has taken place in ancient times as well, in the Old Testament, when Israel and Judea, the southern kingdom, were controlled by openly bad kings, even from the line of David, right? Solomon's children, for example. And you just have to live through these periods knowing that it's like similar to a family member who's either on heroin or has dementia or is mentally ill. you have to look after them and still care for them, knowing that they actually may hurt you. Your own country may hurt you. It may make bad decisions, may make you feel uncomfortable. You have to bear that pain. And yes, it sounds really rough, but you have to struggle through that, carry that cross through those generations, or even that one generation that it takes. And it's happened before in history. And this, what we live with today, the Soviet baggage, just needs to be understood from that perspective. Not saying we need to make excuses for Marxism. We just need to understand that in a loving way. The Russian people were sick for a long time, and we're healing now. We're getting better, but we shouldn't, paint the Soviet period in a positive light because of that. I mean, not the entire period, not the policies of the state, but the people themselves. They were very much under oppression, under this destructive ideology, and to move forward, we have to come to terms with it through a Christian perspective. So, Arthur, that's a great question. Glad you asked it.
Yeah, all I would say is that as far as the Soviet Union goes, again, that was a great answer, Dmitry. I just think, especially as a Westerner, this idea that, oh, the Soviet Union was bad and the West was good, therefore, Russians bad or whatever, that's just wrong. And I think to say, we've made this point on the show before, but it's pretty obvious that while the short-term evil of the Soviet Union was endured for a time by the Russian people, it protected them from the rot of Western secularism that continues to provide a much better material livelihood per se than perhaps communism or whatever it was that you call the late Soviet Union. But now we have a hollowed out spiritual desert where there's no institutional churches. There's really nothing within the framework of the society and the ethnos that is actually Christian anymore. There just happen to be a lot of people that are Christian. Whereas in Russia, while yes, sure, there was the big triumph of atheism, it protected them from this more subtle, I guess, rot, you could say. So it's important to view it through that perspective. But at the same time, right now in Russia, I think it is okay to kind of be a bit harder on Soviet nostalgia because in Russia, they're kind of at an inflection point civilizationally, and they really need to put all of that aside because returning to that isn't going to help anybody right now. But moving on to the next question, we have a question from Orthodox Dissident. Recently saw an interesting thread on Twitter detailing the interactions of a certain painter from Austria and his army with Mount Athos during World War II. I'm not entirely sure what to make of it, so I would be curious to hear your thoughts that you guys have. All right, thank you. That's a good question, and I saw that thread as well. I thought it was a good thread. I think everybody should read it. I'll have it linked below. But as far as the actual situation, of course, it's tough because at the time in World War I and World War II, both of those times, the Axis and the Allied powers, or the Central and the Allied powers, they would ally with all sorts of different groups across Europe. Of course, the Allies were literal allies of the communists. Of course, the Third Reich were allies with characters like the Ustashi and others around the world that we know did terrible things to Orthodox Christians. But at the same time, I know from reading My Elder Joseph by Elder Ephraim that they have a whole little chapter about Hitler and the Third Reich on Athos, and it doesn't say anything negative. It just says that Hitler personally protected the mountain and sent a lot of food supplies to the monks there. And the fact that the Nazis were so interested in history and that Germans in general actually were very curious about Byzantine history in this era, it makes sense that they would do this. And Greece was a hotbed of communism. There was basically orthodoxy and nationalists and monarchists, and the other side were communists. And of course, the Athonite monks had seen what the Soviet Union had done to the largest Christian Orthodox country and empire in the world at the time. So it only makes sense that from a political perspective, they would support the Nazis.
Absolutely. You have to understand that the Nazi Party and the Third Reich itself never had open persecution of Orthodox Christianity like the Soviet Union did. And this, in fact, had turned a lot of Orthodox Christians, both individually and local churches, actually, to view the Third Reich as something favorable in Europe. This just needs to be understood in the context of the time, as well as, I would say, the other element of actually visiting Mount Athos, becoming involved in most of the relics being held there, and its sort of ancient history would fall under that semi-perennialist aspect that the Third Reich did have amongst some of its elite members. For example, the Ahnenerbe organization formed in 1935 by Himmler, investigating sort of ancient relics from various religions, Buddhists, pagan religions, related to the legend of the Nibelungs, or even the search for the Holy Grail, things which we may find a little bit funny and quirky, but very much falls under the Aether Hour guys. And Mount Athos has not, these sort of ancient relics belonging to, of course, the Christian faith, but in abundance, right? So when the Nazis sent exploration groups into Tibet and other places, Mount Athos, I mean, being the holy mountain, even for the German people, does hold some of that mystical and mysterious aspect, which a lot of the Protestant denominations, which the Nazis grew up in, the young Nazis and the SS officers really did not have. So of course, it probably really intrigued them to visit such a holy and important place to Christians.
Yeah, and I think in the German mind in general, we should keep this in perspective. We all remember Heinrich Schliemann, who is known as the person that discovered Troy, and he, believed that the Iliad and the Odyssey were based on historical events in some capacity, and said, "I'm going to go over to Anatolia in this region of the world and find Troy and uncover the history of the Greco-Trojan Wars and this era of ancient history that Homer was writing about." And everyone was like, "No, it's all mythological, it wasn't real, believing the most gay and boring version of history you can." But he goes over there, and sure enough, he digs down and he finds Troy, and he understands and is able to make more sense of the actual situation at hand. So, like you said, Dmitry, the Nazis, they were kind of interested in a lot of these ethereal things, and sort of they were in the business of re-enchanting society. And no, I'm not endorsing every single thing ever about Hitler and the Third Reich, but I think on the show that we think a lot of the current propaganda, whether it's even from the Russians constantly using the denazification slur, we think it's a bit tired at this point. And as people who do want to re-enchant society and bring about a whimsical Christian civilization of the future, I think that only makes sense that the monks of Mount Athos would both receive the Germans at the time warmly, and that the Germans would have treated them well. But moving on here, of course, we have Monarchist American, who asked a lot of really good questions, so we're going to get to them in a specific order. But thank you again for the great questions, sir. And we're going to start off here with a question about Central European monarchy. He says, "I believe that a lasting European peace might only arise from a restoration of a truly independent Habsburg monarchy in Central Europe. This could create a real buffer between East and West. What nations may be part of this jurisdiction and why?"
Thank you for listening to this free segment of the Aether Hour. For the full subscriber-only episode, make sure to check out our World War Now Substack in the video description. In the complete fourth Q&A episode, we discussed the apostasy of European history, political implications of the papacy, the mystery of Medvedev, illegal immigration viewed from an Orthodox political perspective, and hear about Conrad's views on the modern state of Russia. We thank you for your support and look forward to hearing from you.